Sarah McKinnon stood 6 feet 9 inches tall in her worn leather boots, casting a shadow that stretched across the dusty main street of Copper Ridge like a dark omen. The year was 1847, and in this remote corner of the Arizona Territory, where men measured their worth by the cattle they owned and the land they claimed, a woman of such imposing stature was nothing short of supernatural. Her auburn hair caught the late afternoon sun as she dismounted from her black stallion, each movement deliberate and commanding. The townspeople who had gathered to witness her arrival whispered among themselves, their voices carrying a mixture of fear and fascination that only the truly extraordinary could inspire. Thomas Whitmore had been working his small homestead just outside Copper Ridge for 3 years, fighting against drought, locusts, and the occasional band of raiders who swept down from the mountains like vengeful spirits. At 5 feet 6 inches, he was considered average for his time, but standing in Sarah's presence made him feel like a child. He had first seen her 2 weeks ago at the general store, purchasing supplies with gold coins that gleamed brighter than anything he had ever witnessed. She had looked at him then with eyes the color of storm clouds, and something in that gaze had changed everything he thought he knew about his quiet, predictable life. The mystery of Sarah McKinnon began with her arrival in Copper Ridge on a Tuesday morning when the desert heat was already shimmering off the red rocks that surrounded their small settlement. She rode into town alone, leading a pack horse loaded with more supplies than most families saw in a year. Her clothes were well-made but travel-worn, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had seen things that would break lesser souls. When Sheriff Coleman approached her to inquire about her business in their town, she had simply smiled and said she was looking for a place to call home. But homes in the Arizona Territory required more than just desire, they required the strength to defend them, and Sarah McKinnon possessed strength in abundance. Thomas first spoke to Sarah 3 days after her arrival, when he found her examining the boundary markers of the Henderson place, a spread that had been abandoned after Apache raids claimed the previous owner's life 6 months earlier. She was running her fingers along the weathered fence posts, her expression thoughtful as she surveyed the rolling hills that stretched toward the distant mountains. When she noticed Thomas watching her from his own property line, she walked over with long, confident strides that covered ground faster than his horse at a trot. Her voice carried a slight accent he couldn't place, something that suggested education and refinement that seemed at odds with her practical clothing and the pair of Colt revolvers she wore at her hips. She told him she was considering purchasing the Henderson property, and asked about the quality of the water and soil. Thomas found himself answering her questions with more detail than necessary, drawn in by her genuine interest and the way she listened with complete attention. When their conversation ended, she thanked him with a formal politeness that left him wondering about her past and the circumstances that had brought such an unusual woman to their remote corner of the territory. The first hint that Sarah McKinnon was not what she appeared to be came during her second week in Copper Ridge, when Marcus Brennan and his 3 sons rode up to her newly purchased property with intentions that were anything but neighborly. The Brennan clan had been terrorizing smaller homesteaders for years, using intimidation and violence to force sales of prime grazing land at prices that barely covered the cost of moving elsewhere. They had expected to find another frightened settler, someone who would cave to their demands without resistance. Instead, they found Sarah McKinnon waiting for them on her front porch, her impressive height making her seem even more formidable against the backdrop of her modest cabin. Thomas had been mending fence on his property when he heard the shouting, and he rode toward the commotion with his rifle across his saddle, expecting to find Sarah in desperate need of help. What he discovered instead challenged everything he thought he understood about courage and capability. Sarah stood facing down for armed men without visible fear, her hands resting casually near her weapons while she spoke in calm, measured tones that somehow carried more menace than Marcus Brennan's bellowed threats. The confrontation ended when Sarah drew both revolvers in a motion so fluid and fast that Thomas barely saw it happen, and suddenly the Brennan men were staring down the barrels of her weapons while she explained in her polite, educated voice exactly what would happen if they ever set foot on her property again. The Brennan men rode away that day, but Thomas could see in their faces that this encounter was far from over. Marcus Brennan had built his reputation on the fear he inspired in others, and being outdrawn by a woman, regardless of her size, was a humiliation he would not tolerate. Thomas tried to warn Sarah about the kind of man she was dealing with, but she listened with the patient smile of someone who had faced far worse dangers than anything the Arizona Territory could offer. She thanked him for his concern and invited him to stay for coffee, and as they sat on her porch watching the sun set behind the mountains, Thomas found himself falling under the spell of her mysterious presence. Sarah's past began to reveal itself in fragments, like pieces of a shattered mirror that reflected distorted images of a life lived far from the simple existence she claimed to seek. She mentioned cities Thomas had never seen, spoke casually of theatrical performances and social gatherings that seemed to belong to a different world entirely. Sometimes she would catch herself mid-sentence, as if realizing she had said too much, and would redirect the conversation back to matters of farming and frontier life. These glimpses into her former existence only deepened the mystery surrounding her, and Thomas found himself spending more and more time on the boundary between their properties, hoping for another chance encounter. The truth about Sarah McKinnon began to emerge 3 weeks after the confrontation with the Brennan clan, when a stranger rode into Copper Ridge asking questions about a tall woman who might have passed through town recently. The stranger was well-dressed despite the dust of long travel, and he carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to having his questions answered. Sheriff Coleman was naturally suspicious of outsiders making inquiries about recent arrivals, but the stranger produced credentials identifying him as Detective Harrison Wells of the Chicago Metropolitan Police, and his questions suddenly took on an official urgency that made everyone uncomfortable. Thomas learned about the detective's arrival from Doc Peterson, who had been in the sheriff's office when Wells presented his credentials and began describing a woman who matched Sarah's distinctive appearance perfectly. According to the detective, Sarah McKinnon was wanted in connection with a series of bank robberies that had plagued the Midwest over the past 2 years. The crimes were notable not just for their audacity, but for the fact that they appeared to have been committed by a woman working alone, someone who possessed both the physical capability and the strategic intelligence to outsmart experienced lawmen across multiple states. The revelation hit Thomas like a physical blow, challenging everything he thought he knew about the woman who had been occupying more and more of his thoughts. The Sarah he had come to know seemed incapable of the violence and deception that Detective Wells described, but as he reflected on their conversations, he began to notice details that took on new significance in light of these accusations. Her casual familiarity with weapons, the gold coins she used for purchases, her educated manner of speech that suggested a background far removed from honest frontier life, all of these things suddenly formed a pattern that pointed toward a truth he was reluctant to accept. Detective Wells established himself at the hotel and began conducting interviews with anyone who had interacted with Sarah since her arrival in Copper Ridge. His methodical approach and persistent questioning created an atmosphere of suspicion and unease that spread through the small community like wildfire. Thomas found himself torn between his growing feelings for Sarah and his duty as a law-abiding citizen, a conflict that intensified when Wells approached him directly for information about his interactions with the suspect. The detective's questions were pointed and professional, designed to elicit specific details about Sarah's behavior, her possessions, and any comments she might have made about her past. The night before Wells planned to arrest Sarah, Thomas rode to her property under cover of darkness, driven by a compulsion he couldn't fully explain. He found her sitting on her porch, as if she had been expecting him, her tall frame silhouetted against the lamplight from her cabin. When he told her about Detective Wells and the accusations he had brought from Chicago, Sarah listened without apparent surprise, her storm-gray eyes reflecting in sadness that suggested she had been carrying this burden for longer than he could imagine. Her response to his warning would change everything he thought he understood about justice, survival, and the complex moral landscape of frontier life. Sarah's story, as she told it that night under a canopy of desert stars, painted a picture of circumstances that challenged simple notions of right and wrong. She had indeed been involved in the bank robberies that Detective Wells described, but her motivation had been far more complex than simple greed. 3 years earlier, her younger brother had been falsely accused of cattle rustling by a corrupt sheriff in Kansas, and despite her family's attempts to prove his innocence, he had been sentenced to 10 years of hard labor in a prison known for its brutal conditions. The banks she had robbed were all connected to the political machine that had destroyed her brother's life, and every dollar she had taken was part of a larger plan to expose the corruption that had cost her family everything. Thomas listened to her story with a mixture of fascination and growing understanding, recognizing in her actions the same fierce loyalty to family that drove his own decisions about working his difficult homestead. Sarah explained how she had spent months planning each robbery, studying the bank's security measures and the schedules of their guards, always careful to ensure that no one was hurt during her operations. The money she had stolen was intended to fund legal appeals and pay for investigators who could uncover the evidence needed to prove her brother's innocence. But her plan had been complicated by the relentless pursuit of law enforcement officials like Detective Wells. The revelation of Sarah's true motivations created a moral dilemma that Thomas had never anticipated facing. On one hand, she was clearly guilty of the crimes Wells had described, and harboring a known fugitive would make Thomas an accessory to her illegal activities. On the other hand, her story revealed a system of justice that was itself corrupt, and her actions could be seen as a desperate attempt to right wrongs that the legal system had ignored. As he struggled with this decision, Thomas found himself questioning not just Sarah's guilt or innocence, but the nature of justice itself in a world where power and money often mattered more than truth. Detective Wells made his move the following morning, arriving at Sarah's property with Sheriff Coleman and 2 deputies, expecting to find a desperate fugitive who would either surrender quietly or attempt a futile resistance. What they found instead was an empty cabin and a cold campfire, suggesting that Sarah had departed sometime during the night with all of her possessions. The only sign that she had ever been there was a note addressed to Thomas, thanking him for his kindness and warning him to be careful about trusting representatives of a legal system that served the interests of the powerful rather than the cause of justice. The disappearance of Sarah McKinnon created a sensation that extended far beyond the borders of Copper Ridge, drawing attention from newspapers and law enforcement agencies across the territory. Detective Wells organized search parties and established checkpoints on every major road leading out of the area, convinced that a woman of Sarah's distinctive appearance couldn't remain hidden for long in the sparse population of the Arizona Territory. Thomas participated in the search efforts, though his heart wasn't truly committed to the task of helping capture someone whose story had touched something deep within his own sense of right and wrong. 3 days into the search, Thomas discovered something that changed his understanding of Sarah's escape and her ultimate destination. While checking his cattle in a remote section of his property, he found evidence that someone had camped there recently, and among the cold ashes of a carefully concealed campfire was a piece of paper with a hastily drawn map showing a route through the mountains toward California. The map included landmarks that only someone familiar with the local terrain could have known, suggesting that Sarah had spent time studying the geography of the area long before her confrontation with Detective Wells forced her to flee. The map also included a message that Thomas recognized as being meant specifically for him, written in Sarah's distinctive handwriting and hidden in a way that ensured only he would find it. The message was brief but significant, explaining that she had never intended to involve him in her troubles, but that his kindness had meant more to her than he could possibly understand. She urged him to continue living the honest life he had chosen, and to remember that sometimes the greatest courage required accepting that there were problems too large for any individual to solve alone. Thomas kept the discovery of Sarah's message secret from Detective Wells and the search parties, a decision that marked his complete transition from neutral observer to active participant in her escape. He began to understand that his feelings for Sarah had grown beyond simple attraction into something approaching love, despite the brief time they had known each other and the circumstances that now kept them apart. The realization forced him to examine his own values and priorities, questioning whether his quiet life as a frontier farmer was truly fulfilling or simply a way of avoiding the larger challenges that people like Sarah faced with such remarkable courage. The search for Sarah McKinnon continued for 2 more weeks before Detective Wells finally admitted defeat and prepared to return to Chicago. His failure to capture such a distinctive fugitive in the sparse population of the Arizona Territory represented a significant professional embarrassment, and his frustration was evident in his increasingly aggressive questioning of anyone who might have helped Sarah escape. Thomas endured several uncomfortable interviews, but his genuine surprise at Sarah's disappearance and his reputation as an honest, law-abiding citizen helped convince Wells that he had played no role in her flight from justice. On the morning of Detective Wells' departure, Thomas made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He sold his homestead to a neighbor for less than its true value, packed his few possessions onto a sturdy horse, and set out to follow Sarah's trail into the mountains of California. His decision was driven not just by his feelings for her, but by a growing understanding that some forms of justice existed outside the formal legal system, and that people like Sarah McKinnon were fighting battles that deserved support rather than condemnation. The trail Sarah had left was subtle but readable to someone who knew the land as well as Thomas did, and he followed her path through hidden canyons and across high mountain passes that would have challenged even experienced travelers. Along the way, he encountered other people who had met Sarah during her journey, and their stories painted a picture of someone who had helped a stranded family repair their wagon, shared medical supplies with a sick child, and paid fair prices for food and shelter despite her status as a fugitive. These encounters reinforced Thomas's belief that Sarah's character was fundamentally good, regardless of the crimes she had committed in pursuit of justice for her family. Thomas finally caught up with Sarah 3 weeks after beginning his pursuit, finding her camped beside a mountain stream in the Sierra Nevada foothills of California. She was not surprised to see him, explaining that she had been aware of his pursuit for several days and had been debating whether to continue running or to wait and see what he intended to say. Their reunion was complicated by the reality of their situation. Sarah remained a wanted fugitive, and Thomas had now made himself an accessory to her escape, but it was also marked by a recognition that their connection had been strong enough to survive the revelations about her past. Sarah's plans for her future involved more than simply evading capture, and as they talked beside the mountain stream, she explained her intention to continue her fight against the corrupt system that had destroyed her brother's life. She had learned that several other families had suffered similar injustices at the hands of the same political machine, and she believed that organizing these victims could create enough pressure to force real reforms in the legal system. Her vision extended beyond personal revenge toward systemic change, but it would require years of careful work and considerable personal risk. Thomas's decision to join Sarah's crusade was not made lightly, and he understood that it would mean abandoning the safe, predictable life he had built on his homestead in favor of an uncertain future filled with danger and moral complexity. But his time with Sarah had shown him that some causes were worth fighting for, regardless of the personal cost, and that his quiet existence as a frontier farmer had been fulfilling in its way but ultimately too small for the person he was capable of becoming. Their partnership would be built on mutual respect and shared values rather than simple romantic attraction, though their feelings for each other provided an emotional foundation that would sustain them through the difficult times ahead. The transformation of Thomas Whitmore from humble farmer to active participant in Sarah's campaign for justice represented more than just a personal evolution. It symbolized the broader changes taking place across the American frontier as isolated communities became connected to larger social and political movements. Sarah's story had shown him that individual actions could have far-reaching consequences, and that the choice between safety and justice was one that defined not just personal character, but the moral direction of society itself. Their story continued beyond the borders of the Arizona Territory, as Sarah and Thomas worked together to build a network of allies and supporters who shared their commitment to reforming a legal system that too often served the interests of the powerful at the expense of ordinary citizens. The skills Sarah had developed during her criminal career proved valuable in their legitimate efforts to gather evidence and organize opposition to corruption, while Thomas's reputation for honesty and his understanding of frontier communities helped them gain the trust of people who might otherwise have been suspicious of their motives. Years later, when Detective Wells finally retired from the Chicago Metropolitan Police, he would still speak of the Sarah McKinnon case as the one that got away, never fully understanding that his failure to capture her had been less important than his inability to recognize the difference between justice and law. The real victory belonged not to those who enforced existing rules, but to those who had the courage to challenge systems that were themselves unjust, and to find in each other the strength to continue fighting for what was right regardless of the personal cost. The legend of the 6'9" woman and the humble farmer who learned to live with giants became part of the folklore of the American West, representing the idea that love could transcend social boundaries and that justice sometimes required breaking laws that were themselves broken. Their story reminded future generations that the most important battles were often fought not by armies or governments, but by individuals who chose to stand up for their principles even when doing so required sacrificing the safety and comfort of conventional life. In choosing each other, Sarah and Thomas had also chosen a path that challenged them to become larger than their circumstances, proving that sometimes learning to live with giants meant discovering the giant within yourself. The sun was setting over the California mountains when Sarah and Thomas finally received the news they had been waiting for during 3 long years of their campaign. A telegram arrived at the small-town post office where they had been staying, delivered by a rider who had traveled 2 days through difficult terrain to find them. The message was brief but carried the weight of vindication that had driven all their efforts since that night in Arizona when Sarah first told Thomas the truth about her past. Her brother James had been released from prison. His conviction overturned after investigators they had funded uncovered evidence of the corruption that had destroyed his life. The evidence had come from an unexpected source, a former sheriff's deputy who had grown sick of carrying the guilt of his participation in the conspiracy that had sent innocent men to prison while allowing the real criminals to profit from their silence. His detailed confession had exposed a network of corruption that extended far beyond James McKinnon's case, implicating judges, politicians, and business leaders in a systematic abuse of power that had affected dozens of families across 3 states. The scandal that followed would eventually lead to significant reforms in the legal system, but for Sarah and Thomas, the most important victory was the knowledge that an innocent man had been freed from an unjust imprisonment. Sarah's reaction to the news surprised Thomas with its quiet intensity. She had carried the burden of her brother's situation for so long that he had expected tears or celebration. But instead she simply sat down heavily in a wooden chair and stared at the telegram as if unable to believe that their long struggle had finally reached a successful conclusion. The woman who had faced down armed men and evaded experienced lawmen with such remarkable composure seemed overwhelmed by the simple act of reading words that meant her family's nightmare was finally over. Thomas understood that Sarah's subdued response reflected more than just relief at her brother's freedom. During their 3 years together, she had grown accustomed to defining herself through her mission to save James, and the success of that mission now forced her to confront questions about who she was and what she wanted when that driving purpose was no longer necessary. The skills and determination that had made her such an effective outlaw and later such a dedicated reformer would need to find new channels, and the transition from crusader to ordinary citizen would require its own form of courage. Their conversation that night, as they sat beside their campfire under the vast California sky, covered territory that had been too dangerous to explore while they were still focused on their immediate goals. Sarah spoke about her fears that Thomas had fallen in love with the dramatic circumstances of their meeting rather than with the person she might become when those circumstances no longer defined her existence. She worried that the quiet life he had abandoned to follow her might ultimately prove more appealing than the uncertain future they would need to build together now that their crusade had achieved its primary objective. Thomas's response revealed how much he had changed during their time together, and how completely his understanding of himself and his capabilities had evolved since that first encounter with Sarah outside the general store in Copper Ridge. He told her that the humble farmer she had met in Arizona had been only a small part of who he was capable of becoming, and that their shared experiences had shown him possibilities for his life that he never could have imagined while working his isolated homestead. The challenges they had faced together had taught him that love was not about finding someone who fit comfortably into an existing life, but about choosing someone with whom you could build something entirely new. Sarah's smile, when it finally came, transformed her entire face in a way that reminded Thomas of the first time he had made her laugh during one of their early conversations about farming techniques and frontier life. The woman who could intimidate hardened criminals and outmaneuver experienced lawmen possessed a capacity for joy and tenderness that she had rarely been able to express during the dangerous years of their partnership. Her acceptance of his commitment to their future together marked not just a personal victory, but the beginning of a new chapter in both their lives. The decision about where to settle and how to use their hard-won freedom required careful consideration of both practical and emotional factors. Sarah's notoriety as a bank robber had faded somewhat during the 3 years since Detective Wells had pursued her through Arizona, but her distinctive appearance meant that she would always be recognizable to anyone who had seen the wanted posters that had once decorated sheriff's offices across multiple territories. They needed to find a place where Sarah's past would not overshadow their future, but also where Thomas could use his agricultural skills and Sarah could apply her remarkable intelligence and determination to constructive purposes. They chose a valley in Northern California where the soil was rich and the nearest town was small enough that newcomers were judged more by their actions than by their histories. Thomas purchased land with money Sarah had saved from her outlaw days, funds that had originally been intended for her brother's legal defense but could now be invested in their shared future. Sarah proved to be as capable a farmer as she had been a criminal and a reformer, applying the same careful planning and attention to detail that had made her so effective in her previous careers. The community that slowly grew up around their farm included other people who had come to California seeking fresh starts and second chances. And Sarah's story became part of a larger narrative about redemption and transformation that defined much of the state's early development. Her height, which had once made her a memorable criminal, now made her a respected figure in local disputes and community decisions, and the confidence that had served her so well during dangerous confrontations proved equally valuable in the more mundane challenges of building schools and organizing harvests. Thomas often reflected on the changes that had brought them from that chance meeting in Arizona to their current life as respected members of a growing agricultural community. The humble farmer who had once measured his worth by the modest success of his small homestead had learned that true fulfillment came not from the safety of isolation, but from the risks and rewards of sharing life with someone whose vision extended far beyond the boundaries of conventional existence. Sarah had taught him that learning to live with giants meant recognizing that everyone possessed the capacity for greatness when challenged by circumstances that demanded more than ordinary responses. Years later, when their own children asked about how their parents had met, Sarah and Thomas would tell a simplified version of their story that emphasized the importance of standing up for justice and supporting each other through difficult times. The more dramatic details of bank robberies and midnight escapes would be saved for when the children were old enough to understand the complex moral questions that had shaped their parents' early relationship. But even the simplified version conveyed the essential truth that love could triumph over seemingly impossible obstacles when two people were willing to risk everything for each other and for what they believed was right. The legacy of Sarah McKinnon and Thomas Whitmore extended beyond their personal happiness to influence the broader development of justice and community in the American West. Their story became part of the folklore that helped define the region's character, representing the idea that individual courage and determination could overcome systematic corruption, and that true partnership required not just affection but shared commitment to principles larger than personal comfort or safety. In learning to live with giants, they had discovered that the real giants were the challenges that tested their values and the love that gave them strength to meet those challenges together. The final image of their story, as it was remembered by the community they helped build, was of Sarah and Thomas working side by side in their fields during harvest time, her impressive height allowing her to reach fruit that others could not, while his knowledge of soil and seasons ensured that their land produced abundance year after year. They had learned that the most important victories were not won through dramatic confrontations or narrow escapes, but through the daily choice to support each other and to build something lasting from the foundation of trust and mutual respect they had discovered during their most dangerous and uncertain times together.